Hi, this is Rachel. I'm going to talk to you guys about suicide assessment and suicide protocol. Just real briefly, suicide is an increasing health concern in the United States. Over 40,000 people die by suicide each year, and it's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States for people of all ages. For every 25 attempts, there is one successful suicide. So it's just it's on the rise. It's important to note that suicide is preventable, and if you understand the myths and warning signs, then you're able to help prevent someone from committing suicide. So here are some myths about suicide. One is that only males die by suicide. This is not true. Suicide does not discriminate. Um, Women are more likely to attempt it. Men might be more successful. However, it affects everybody. Suicidal teens overreact to life events. So I think this is easy for adults to just kind of write off what a teenager is going through is not a big deal, but we have to remember that their perceived crisis is just as concerning as an actual crisis. Another myth is that talking to teens about suicide makes them more likely to kill themselves. This is false. This actually might give them a platform to feel open and express their thoughts and maybe get the help they need for themselves or for someone that they care about. Another myth is that suicide happens without warning. Most teens and people that commit suicide or die by suicide have communicated their plans to at least one other person. So it's important that any sort of communications or comments are taken seriously so that people can get the help they need. Here are some signs and symptoms. We're not going to talk about all of them, but some of the more obvious ones are talking about wanting to die or kill themselves, feeling empty and hopeless, making and having a plan or means. So having access to whatever they plan to do to kill themselves, having access to gun or pills, feeling trapped, using or abusing drugs and alcohol, withdrawing from friends and family, change in eating and sleeping habits, showing rage, or just having extreme mood swings, and obviously giving away important possessions and saying goodbye to friends and family are huge warning signs. And then over here, I've got the suicide lifeline. If you ever needed to get someone help, they could call this line. Some risk factors. So all genders, ages, and ethnicities can be at risk of suicide. There's no single cause. Many factors contribute to it, but it's really important to remember it's not a normal response to stress. So, people that are thinking about this really need to get help so that they can continue living, because suicide's not a normal response to dealing with stress. And there's probably other factors involved than just stress. Some of these factors might include depression and mental disorders, medical conditions, chronic pain, prior suicide attempts, or history of family attempted suicide, family violence or abuse, access to guns, and being exposed to other suicidal behavior. Risk assessments are used to assess someone's suicide risk. Using the assessment, the information gathered in an assessment, a counselor can increase client safety. They'll determine potential risk factors, and then the counselor can determine how and when to intervene. So some risk assessments, one of them is called, there's several. One of them is called SAD person scale. Basically what you do is you look at each of these risk factors, and if you look down here at the bottom, there's a scoring system. So for each one of these areas that a person falls under, so let's say they have no significant other, they're sick, and they have a plan, you'd give them a point for each one of those. And then you'd add up the points here to help you determine, is this a real problem? Do you just only need to keep watch, or do you need to send them home, or do they need to be hospitalized immediately? So this was the SAD persons scale. Here's just a flow plan for the suicide protocol at the Heart District. There was also something in some of the information I had for TIPM. That's just assessing clients' thoughts, their intent, do they have a plan, and do they have the means to carry out their plan. Is path warm? This is another suicide assessment for a counselor to run through. Basically, this is an updated version of the SADS person scale. A counselor could run through these and see, how many of these apply to their client. Are they expressing suicide ideation? Are they abusing any substances? Do they feel purposeless or have no reason to live? Do they feel angry? Do they feel trapped in their situation and death feels preferable to living in the pain that they're in? Do they feel hopeless? Are they withdrawing from their friends and family and society? Are they experiencing anxiety or lack of sleep? Are they participating in risky or reckless behavior without seeming to consider the consequences? Does their mood change a lot? So a counselor, again, just like the SAD persons, can run through each of these and determine the level of risk that their client is experiencing. And then once a counselor has assessed their client for suicide and the risk of it, then they can run through a program. So SCAT is actually a protocol that a counselor can use to help their client. So once they've done the assessment, if they've determined that their client is at risk, the first thing they would need to do is stay. So stay with the client. If they are presenting the intent of suicide, they should not be left alone. The counselor needs to remain with them until they're hospitalized or there's someone else monitoring their client. Next is consulting. So you need to make sure that someone is monitoring your client, either another counselor, another medical professional, or maybe a police officer. And then you would consult with your clinical supervisor to develop a plan or treatment for the client. If there is no supervisor available, then implement the 4 or 5 rule. So that's where you would consult with 4 or 5 other mental professionals with equal or greater education and background. Once you come up with a treatment plan, you would speak with the client, let them know what your suicide assessment findings were and the treatment recommendations. Start by praising them for recognizing their concerns and getting counseling and getting the help they need. And then if hospitalization is necessary, explain the difference between voluntary and involuntary hospitalization, which is that 72-hour hold. So if it's voluntary, they can leave if a medical health professional thinks that they're okay. If it's involuntary, they are going to be held for 72 hours. Then terminate or truncate. So this is critical to understand how a client plans to commit suicide. The counselor should use the information gathered earlier in the assessment to terminate the client's access to the planned suicide instrument. So if they're going to use a gun and they have access to a gun, the counselor needs to make sure that someone else can remove that gun from the situation, remove it from their access. If it can't be terminated, then the counselor needs to try to cut off the means. So if they're going to overdose on antidepressants, the counselor should speak with their physician and have the medicine reduced or dispensed in smaller amounts. So instead of monthly prescriptions, maybe they can get weekly prescriptions, and possibly request that someone else, like a family member, hold on to the medication and actually distribute it to the client so that they are not, they don't have access to all of the pills. Just with this, it's important that you have a release of information when you're talking to other people about your client's situation. And then lastly is the transport. So if the client is okay to be released to family members, then release them to the family members. However, if the client is at serious risk and needs to go to the hospital, then either if they're volunteering, they would go with family members, or involuntary, you would need to have a local police agency take them to the hospital. And here are some resources. The time is running out, so thank you guys for listening. Hope you all have a great night.